The first sound was a bell that was not rung, a bronze circle waiting in the dim, high air like a held breath. Light had not yet risen to find it. The great September held its own weather at dawn. Chill stone damp as a river cave, incense from the night before folded into the ribs of the vaults, old wax sweet and faintly sour, echo and hush and the drag of felt shoes across polished floors. A novice carried a copper basin the size of a small shield along a cloistered passage beside the maid's chapel. Water stilled to a glass that remembered every flicker. The basin steadied as if it had learned long ago to balance on the thinnest strength. She moved as if made for serving walls, her head bowed. No one noticed her except the walls. Under the linen coif, beneath the plain face she wore like an obedient mask, Arya Stark counted the beat between her heart's thuds and the far, rigid silences in the stone. It was not a count she had been taught on any road north or east, but the numbers kept her hands still. She had watched the Septa's hours before they rose, how they moved their weight so the water stayed calm, how they turned through doorways without pressing a shoulder to the frame. She knew where the floor opened into old chips that would catch a thin soul. She did not know how the sun would pass across those tessellated saints by afternoon, but she had traced the grout with her eyes until the lines of it ran through her. A map of patience, of waiting. The face itched, not like a gnat, not like a scab, like a borrowed name. The itch was in her throat too, where names had once lived comfortably and had been slowly starved. She swallowed them when they tried to rise. Arya. She told the inside of her mouth with her teeth shut. Arya of Winter. The word snagged on the fibers of the coif, and she bit the inside of her cheek until iron woke on her tongue and the syllables retreated. The copper basin rocked. She matched it, then calmed it. Outside the long windows the city was still, a robe before the wearer stirs. Somewhere, a gull flung 3 high cries against the dawn, and the sound bounced like thrown pebbles off every silvered dome, every whitewashed wall and scaffold and vine-entangled drain. It came worn by the time it reached the September, as if it had been alive and now was only the memory of a bird. Arya had learned to listen to the ending of sounds. Ends told you where to step. The passage opened into a sacristy where the air was the cold of wet fingertips. Silent sisters were preparing linens. Their hands, blunt and merciless, folding shroudcloth on the black marble table where oil lamps already made small lakes of light. The novices parted around them. The novice with the copper basin, Arya, looked down as the sisters looked through her. She could see her mouth, pale and obedient, rippling across the basin's water. The face that looked back did not belong to anyone knew. A small whitefish face, a clever blank, a harmless thing. It had taken hours in a windowless room with a scraped chair and a bowl of paste and the needle to lay that face over her own. And when it set, she had stared into it until it no longer frightened her. It was not the first face she had worn, but it was the first that would look directly into the eyes of a woman she had followed in her sleep for years. On the far wall of the sacristy, mosaics showed the father's stern brow, justice weighed on his palm, the mother's long fingers against the cheek of a kneeling penitent, the warrior halt in his stride, as if listening to something beneath his feet. Beneath the warrior, a crack radiated like a thin sunburst. Arya's gaze went to it as she had before. The crack began at his boot. The old stone held more stories than anyone wanted to hear. Hands closed over her forearms, not unkindly. She set the basin down and looked up as she should. A living silence, a creature made to carry instructions. The sisters' eyes were the color of weak tea, and the skin around them had been folded and unfolded so often that each fold had its own memory. "To the inner door," the sister said, in a voice that had been carved down to its cleanest lines. "Wait for the bell. You will pour when you are told." Arya drew breath as if to ask which bell, but the sister did not give her the grace of the question. A nod was the only coin that spent here. Arya nodded. She lifted the basin again, the weight pulling her elbows down and her shoulders back, and went through the sacristy door into the corridor that ran like a vein along the base of the Sept's heart. She had walked this passage twice in the 2 days since she had entered the precincts, once with the lamplighter, once alone, measuring herself against each narrow slant of light that fell through arrow-slit windows. The smells changed in a sequence. Wax, dust, incense, lye, old oil, the damp of stone, a faint smell of hair, and then the smell that could be water or fear. It gathered beneath the inner door's lintel and drifted out into the corridor, ground low as mist. She put the basin down at the door. The water was unbroken. She leaned her back against the wall and let the cool pass through the linen and the wool straight into her skin. She closed her eyes and let the stone tell her how far she had come. Here was where she had stood with a stolen broom the afternoon before, watchful as a mouse, while a Septon muttered the names of the cracked tiles in a voice like prayer. Here was where a novice had stumbled and spilled a jar of thin oil, and while others sopped it with rags, Arya had counted doors, counted the breaths of the man who waited behind each. Here was where another novice had whispered a secret to the stone to see if the stone would keep it. Arya had whispered nothing. When she opened her eyes again, she watched her fingers on the basin's rim. The nails were trimmed to the quick. There was a thin pale ring where a blade's clasp had rested once, for years. The blade W. As elsewhere now, she had another blade, a narrower one, hidden in humble wood where no one looked too long. She was not thinking about the blade, she told herself and believed herself, and then she thought of it anyway. The inner door moved without visible hand. It moved with the slow thoughtfulness stone gives to wood, and a dark sliver opened that could not yet take light. A woman's voice came through that sliver, unexpected. It was unsteady, as if it had been steady for years and had suddenly been reminded that it rested on breath, and breath runs out. Water! Arya lifted the basin, almost dropping under its weight now that the ask hung in the air. She stepped forward into that sliver. It widened enough to pass her, then closed against her back, and she was inside the chamber that had been built to hold the very breath of nobles until it calmed enough to leave the September under its own command. She had thought she was ready to stand in the same air as the woman whose name had dried to a scab on her tongue years ago. The body has more doors than the mind. Some had opened without warning. The room smelled of lye and milksap and the sting of tar. Curtains had been drawn back from tall, narrow windows to let the light collect in long white pillars on the floor. In that light, the flagstones were not stones at all but panes of cool water, and the woman in the plain shift stood barefoot in the clearest of them, arms at her sides. Two silent sisters stood near her, one with a bowl, one with a folded length of cloth like a campaign flag at rest. A Septa hovered at the room's edge like a patient moth, eyes down, lips pressed. The woman had no jewelry on her body, not even the intention of jewelry. Her hair had been cut to a shade. The raw line of scalp glowed like a fine-boned path in the light that fell from the window. She had always been taller in Arya's mind. She was not large, not now, not here. The basin crept into Arya's hands as if it knew where to go and did not need her permission. She lowered it to the small table beside the woman, and the sisters stepped back to let it arrive. The woman looked at the water as if it were a mirror and a threat. Arya stood where the novices stood, a pace removed, a part of the wall that breathed. She could hear beyond the door a murmur like bees in a hollow tree. The city had begun waking. The city would attend. The woman lifted her eyes. They ran over Arya as if taking measure of a piece of furniture left there overnight. Then they came back quick as a bird. It was not recognition. It was curiosity given a point. "You," the woman said, and her voice found itself. "Come closer." Arya did as ordered, metal on her forearms chafing the wool through which she held the basin steady. The woman looked at the water and at Arya and at the water again and said, "Pour." The voice made a habit of command even in a room where command had been lifted from her like a garment. Arya poured. The woman washed her hands in the water as if the water were an argument. She washed high to the wrists. The room listened. The woman did not look at Arya again, but Arya studied the line of her mouth in the mirror of the basin as it moved, the parting and sealing, the way the left corner climbed slightly higher when she tightened her jaw. She studied the small line beside the mouth that had not been there in the girlhood tales told once to a wolf-pelted listener at a long table where bread steamed and laughter had its own seat. The woman's lips thinned. She dipped her head slightly and water dripped from her fingers. It rang on the metal like tiny bells out of order. Arya swallowed. Her father had stood not far from this room on a day of crowded sun, and the city had bent to watch him the way a field bends when the wind comes. She had been a different set of bones then, a child who believed that if she held her breath long enough, the world would let her slip past. When she let the breath go, the sword had fallen. Everything from that moment had led to this one, this small lift of the woman's chin, this thin line of scalp, this white light on stone, this basin's roll around the rim under her fingers. It did not feel like revenge. Revenge had been a hotter idea, a run. This had the temperature of a winter morning when the first light shows the pattern the frost made in the night and you cannot decide if you are seeing beauty or a map of something that will cut your feet. The silent sister with the cloth stepped forward and the woman lifted her chin so the cloth could be laid along the back of her neck. "What will they make me do?" the woman asked the air, and the Septa answered, "What you agreed." The woman's eyes narrowed in a way that would have scared servants and courtiers and men with their own swords on their hips. It did not scare the silent sisters. They had lived in rooms that held more kinds of quiet than fear. The Septa said, "It will be over." And the woman gave a small sound that could have been a laugh and could have been a cough. Arya had not meant to speak in this room. The plan did not include her voice. But voices are like knives. Sometimes they slip in when your hand is steady and you do not think you are holding anything. "There is a crowd," she said, soft enough that it could have been the water. The woman's eyes were drawn to the sound. They climbed from the basin to the plain coif and the novice's small pale face and stayed long enough to be a stare. "What is your name?" she asked, as if the question were an instrument and she wanted to test whether it still played the way she remembered. Arya did not say Arya. She said the name she had given the night porter, the lamplighter, the laundry mistress. The syllables were thin and of no house. The woman nodded as if testing a floorboard. "You have small hands," she said and reached. Arya did not flinch. The fingers were cool and dry, the skin rough where rings had once rested. The touch raised the inside of Arya's wrist, where a pulse beat as if it had been told to do so long ago and had not yet received any contrary order. The woman looked at the small blue rope under the skin with interest and then up into Arya's eyes. Interest changed then. A shadow moved, not recognition, but something like the echo of it. "You are not afraid," the woman said. Arya's mouth turned into the piece of furniture it had been rehearsed to be. "I serve," she said. It was the right answer for any question here. To fit all locks. She felt the weight of the hidden wooden handle at her hip, part of a bundle of combs and a thin blade set like a needle in the teeth. Utensils for hair shorn so short that it demanded only ceremony. The room held a shared breath. The bell that had not been rung yet sent a thought through the stone. A faint tremor, a promise of sound. The woman's mouth bent again. "Yes," she said. "That's all anyone is doing." The inner door opened inward and the outer door beyond it did the same, and all the sounds of the city stepped forward as if called by name. The murmur stood up and became a voice that had many throats. Feet shuffled in an eager impatience that always belongs more to those who watch than to those who act. A child's cry punctured the thickening mass. Through the gap Arya could see the pale stare that ran down and down under the sky. Sun-sparked guard helms, the edges of banners, one green and one white, the shadow of the great marble statue's hand on the steps. The hand looked as if it meant to touch the shoulder of anyone who passed beneath it and then, at the last minute, thought better of the familiarity. The woman looked at that light and closed her eyes. The Septa stepped nearer. "It is time," she said, and the woman nodded once. Her face was calm now, the metal taste of calm that has been bitten out of itself, not given. The silent sisters lifted the towel. Water dripped on the stone and made small, moving circles no one watched. The woman put her bare foot into the rectangle of light falling just inside the door and flinched slightly, not from heat or cold but from the sudden exposure of what had been hidden to the idea that it had a shadow. A person learns the size of herself by the shadow she casts upon leaving a room. She had always thought herself taller. Arya moved forward to lead. A novice led. A novice set pace or matched it depending on the power of the person behind. She felt the woman's presence at her back like weather. The air thickened. The bell decided to be a bell. It started high and then remembered its job was to call the city to its appetite for a spectacle and turned its sound like a wheel. The first toll was a clean thing made of shape and metal. The second reached into the lower bones. The third woke birds that had roosted in the ribs of the statues all night, and the sudden flutter of wings made the light waver in its usual ladder. Arya stepped across the threshold. The city poured itself into her eyes. Sun sloped across the square of the faith and struck the octagonal face of the September as if to ask it a question. On the steps, the crowd gathered in shapes formed as much by old habit as by choice. The tradesfolk in their blocks, the boys in the sneaking places, the toothless women who remembered better days and worse ones, the men with 3 scars and 2 teeth who had never been so clean as to be talked down to by anyone without a spear. White robes of the faith closed like petals around the doorway, and beyond them were knights in their flaring capes, the city watch in picturesque shabbiness, and a strip of pavement left bare by some quiet, practical agreement so that the woman in the rough shift might descend without touching anyone she must not touch. The world loves a border. The bell went on. The woman stepped into the sunlight behind Arya, and a sigh traveled across the crowd. There is a way crowds sigh that is neither pity nor joy. It is relief that the story is going to do what stories do, which is to give the faces something to hold in their eyes. Voices rose. Words shaped themselves with the simplicity of stones thrown by lazy boys. Blunt, predictable, effective. Arya heard them without listening. She saw everything and caught no one's gaze. This was how one moved through a city, as the part of the city that does not concern anyone. There was a place at the top of the steps where the light fell without kindness. It made even the most polished stone look like bone. Arya knew that if she stood 3 paces to the left, a flaw in the mason's work would catch her toe. If she paused 1 heartbeat longer than the bell between the 3rd and the 4th toll, the hawker with the copper-riveted cane would knock the cane twice and the sound would be a call and a signal to men with quiet hands. If she let the basin tilt so the light ran across its side like a fish, the woman behind her would turn her head very slightly, compelled by that movement, and the women used to reading deviations would place a hand to a shoulder and lay her steady. She did none of those things. She led down a step, and another, and another, and the heat of the morning built the smallest film between her shoulders and the coif. By the 6th step, the woman had begun to breathe as if the air were a thing to be forgotten and then recalled. Arya's own breath had gone short and steady, the kind that saves itself to keep on. A man shouted something about wine and wolves and queens, and another replied with laughter that did not sound like laughter except in its shape. The city had found its voice for the day. A boy darted forward and was shoved back by a white-robed Septon whose hand was gentle, even in the shove. Everything became rhythm. The bell, the feet, the voices, the light, the breaths. There is a way to sleep standing up and still keep walking. There is a way to be awake when 1,000 eyes are watching your back. Arya's hand slipped to adjust. The weight on her hip, the bundle of combs, the small cloth, the ordinary wooden handle. She had felt a blade fit perfectly in the place between her forearm bones since she was 9. This one had a different fondness, a new score in the skin where the wood had already found her. To use it here would be to break not only a body but a pattern. It demanded an honesty of movement that the crowd would understand without understanding. She had killed men in crowds before, and someone else's body had taken responsibility for the death in the minds of those who saw it. Today the death would stand on its own feet. They had reached the place on the steps where the marble had been worn by 5 generations of worshippers into the shape of what shoes want. A shadow passed over them. A cloud, a bird, a banner luffing. And in that change of light, the world rearranged itself slightly to allow something to happen. The woman behind Arya shifted her weight. A breath left her with a small sound and came back with a soprano scrape. Somewhere to their left a child began to cry inconsolably, as if there had been a pinch. The bell swallowed the sound and offered a soft ringing around its edges that made it more rather than less. Arya turned almost wholly but not quite. She moved as a helpful novice might move when her charge faltered. A half step back, a hand rising to offer an arm for balance. A tilt of the head that said without words that the stair ahead was narrow. The step a little steep, one should take care. The woman's eyes came to Arya's face again. Not in curiosity now, not exactly. There was a kind of calculus in them, a guess at what sort of help this small person might give, what sort of witness the gods might have given her, whether this was mercy or just another angle for someone to watch her in disgrace. The novice's left hand, Arya's hand, was the one the woman saw lifted. The right was lower, closer to the bundle hung at the hip, steering the basin gently. It could have been a pose made to be painted on a chapel wall. The helper, the fallen, the city around them made of mouths. Arya's thumb slid along the wood of the bundle's handle. The blade came into her palm as if she had always had it there and had simply forgotten to look. It was a small blade, narrow as a hunger. In that bright place on the steps, it had no shadow of its own. There were 100 ways to do it. She could lift and drive under the ribs. She could take the throat. She could bring the blade into the valley at the base of the skull and give it a short thought. But those were lessons from rooms in other cities without winter in the stones. She had not walked across all these days to perform a lesson and leave. Her father had taught her how to hold a blade for the first time in a yard where a wind always smelled of horse and wet leaves. She had discovered then that the body holds a map of its truest movements, and the knife finds where it belongs if you let it. She took the woman's wrist as if to steady it. There was no hurry. If one moves a knife like a hurry, a city knows it, and someone else's hand, large and armor strong, arrives from the edge of the eye with iron. She did not feel iron near. The King's Guard were at the base of the steps with their horses brought up for the return. The faith-strong men were not used to looking for blades in towels. This was a place for penance, not for steel. Arya's fingers closed on the thin bones of the wrist. The pulse there jumped once, surprised. The small blade traveled from the hip to the light between two heartbeats and stopped, not in indecision, but in that clean pause a dancer takes before she drops, the body remembering the pleasure of the balance before the fall. The woman's mouth parted. If she had had time to speak, she would have said nothing anyone had not heard before about justice and rage and the lie of the gods. She did not have time. Arya's knife went under the ribs and up and found the soft house where life kept its necessary engines. It was a quick, neat thing, almost like a stitch. The woman's eyes widened. A question bloomed in them, not for Arya, not for the air or the crowd or the gods or the day. It was an inward question, asked of something only she had lived with all her life. Then it left her eyes again. She made a small sound. It was neither a queen's cry nor a whimper. Arya felt the heat of the blood through the wool of her sleeve as it came. The blade had been truthful. She drew it out as if drawing a splinter from her own skin, careful not to make more ruin than necessary in the flesh she had chosen. And she pressed her palm to the wound to hold in a life for the time it took to travel 2 more steps. No one saw. They saw, but they did not understand what they were seeing. The crowd read a stumble. The faith read a weakening. The King's Guard read the city. The bell read only the number of its tolls and kept going. The moth Septa's hands rose. Too slow, too late, and her mouth dropped open the way a mouth opens at the first surprise of a storm. Arya guided the woman down another step. The blood was warm as bread against her hand. When she drew her hand away, the brown of the shift had darkened in one quick flower that undermined the entire garment with its honesty. The woman looked at Arya then. She looked with a clearness that did not belong to a queen or a mother or a guilty penitent. For a moment, she was simply a person in a body who had been stopped. The corners of her mouth moved up, but not for a smile. There was recognition then, but it was not recognition of a face. It was recognition of intention. Someone had wanted something so long and so thoroughly that when it came, it had the weight of weather. The woman saw that and nodded, a small, careful motion like setting a ring down. Arya felt it as a touch on the back of her hand. Beneath her palm, the heart worked twice and made an arrangement of its affairs. The blood went from tea to merely warm. The woman's knees folded. The silent sisters moved at last, but grief, even the mechanical grief of their office, loosed their discipline. One reached to the shoulder, one to the elbow, and Arya helped the woman down with the competence of any servant who does not want a charge to bruise the face. The woman's head rested for a moment on Arya's thigh, an intimacy that had weight to it. In that point of contact, a lifetime's enmity became simply pressure. The crowd did not know. Then it knew all at once. A word moved, a single word with many meanings, and took shapes in 1,000 mouths. It took the form of a name in some, in others of a prayer, in others of laughter that had nowhere to go and so returned to the mouth that made it and soured there. One of the white-cloaked knights at the base of the steps had an instinct, or else he saw the way Arya's hand withdrew and how red it was, and he began to run up the steps at a pace that sent his cape to his shoulders like a bird trying to reland. The moth Septa found her voice at last and cried the name of the mother until her thin voice broke and then quieted, as if the goddess had laid a palm upon it. Arya had not planned the moment after. No plan outlives a living room. She could feel the shape of the city drawing its net, the ease with which it laced around a small person with red on her sleeves and an empty basin and the wrong place to stand. She looked down and saw her hand, palm slick, a blood that had once been hidden under brocade and now saw the sun. She wiped it on the towel because that is what one does in a room when a thing has been spilled. It left a crescent on the cloth that looked like writing. She stood. In the same motion, she stepped back into the place where novices become walls again. The silent sisters had already taken the weight of the woman. They were experts in gravity, in its first touch and in its last. The Kingsguard's boots cracked the air. He reached without thinking and threw an arm to seize the small figure nearest the body, the helper, the novice, the witness. His gauntlet found a shoulder that should have been there. It was not. Arya was not there. She had never been there at all, the crowd would say afterward, remembering the error in the recall that grief gives us for free. She went into the doorway and into the corridor, and the air of the September closed around her like a familiar cloak. The bell, cruel as habit, kept swinging. In the sacristy, the silent sisters who had been folding linen stopped in that stop that happens when a new weight enters a building and the building must accommodate it in its bones. A sister's hands lifted, then lowered. The linen hung from them like surrendered arms. Someone muttered a prayer that had been meant for old women and new mothers and fit no one now. Arya's feet carried her down the corridor with the speed of a person encouraged to hurry and determined not to. To run would be to confess. The body confesses before the mouth does. Down a small stair that had not been swept in some while, into a passage where the smell of old oil became the smell of damp rope, through a door meant for the lamplighters, through a door meant for carts, through a door meant for air. The light outside the service court was sharp and coarse, the light of a city that wakes already tired. A cat darted out from under a barrow and swore in cat language at her and fled. She moved across the court, shadow against the wall, and saw in the corner of her eye the green and white of the reach and the clarity of the faith's white and a deeper red beginning to soak into cloth on the steps above. Behind her, shouts, the kind of shout that belongs to men trained to make their voices into braided cords they can throw. A whistle, the white-caped knight, perhaps others, perhaps the mild men of the faith discovering in themselves a more useful species of anger than they had thought they kept. Arya did not look back. She went forward into a slice of alley kept by old brick and a crooked length of sky. Her feet knew a path that had not yet been learned by the men with braided voices. Left at the rainspout that would come loose in a storm. Under the butcher's awning where the blood had a smell like coins. Across the lane where women set tubs on wooden frames and slapped cloth in water with a sound that could be mistaken for laughter. She took a small piece of cloth from her bundle and wiped the knife and placed the knife where it would not fall out if she jumped. She did not plan to jump. She thought of nothing. She let a pace carry her to the next pace. The blade's weight like an adult finger against her hip reminding her, children are watched more carefully than you imagine. She slid into a bakehouse by the rear where flour dust hung in the air like fog at the mouth of a cave. A boy was turning small loaves on the hearth with a stick and biting the inside of his cheek in concentration. His hair lit white by the flour and by the window's slant. He did not look up. Another boy, older and moving like someone who had not decided fully where he belonged, was shaping a long, plump thing and had stopped at the part where the palms press air out and gentleness in. He looked up, as bakers look up, like men who watch ovens and doors with equal interest. His face was meatier than she remembered, but it was the face she remembered if she stripped it down. It was a fond face, and in such places lives do not weigh strangers very heavily against their own bread. "Back way?" she said. It was not the voice of a novice now, not the neat, folded thing. It was another voice she had kept, a city voice, a voice that could be anything if the listener wanted it to be. The boy squinted flour out of his eyes. He had a name she had once said with laughing mouth full of crumbs. It sat on her tongue now like a pebble. He did not say her name. There was no reason that he should. Back ways full of sacks, he sighed. Wiping his hand on his apron and leaving a pattern like a map of islands there. Fronts for bread. He frowned at her coif, at the towel tucked at her belt with its crescent of red. He frowned without malice, a problem with a reused shape. You got the ovens wrong, he added cheerfully, as if people got ovens wrong all the time. Hot is the other way. He smiled and it made him younger. He gestured with the stick and went back to turning loaves, their bellies gold. She went through the front then, and the bell of the September in the upper air was softer here, and the crowd was a rumor. The street had its own business that outlasted all Queens. A woman counting nails into a child's hand as if each were a blessing, a rat thrown by a cat into the road and immediately taken up by a boy with more speed than suet, a man bowing himself into a wine cellar's doorway with apologies to no one in particular, a cart groaning as if it had nursed its small axle injuries for years and had never written to complain. Arya stepped into this river and it folded around her, and the flour that had settled on her coif turned it into the coif of any servant in any house. The towel at her belt had been quickly turned. The dark crescent now faced her hip. For a moment she let the crowd carry her. It was a skill like any other, to soften the body's edges so it moves where the city wants to take it and then stiffen one elbow or one ankle at the right moment to slide out of the stream by a drain lid or a water seller's cry. She slip-traveled past the cutlers where blades and nails and fishhooks caught light and threw it back as if arguing about what light wanted. Past the shop of a man who sold icons and saints on strings and had an extra thick thumb for smoothing, and whose expression told her all that mattered about how he felt about salvation for a halfpenny. Past a woman in an old green dress with a shawl over it who was telling someone invisible the story of a friend who had not returned from somewhere precise and far. "Girl!" someone shouted behind her, and a hand that did not belong to any memory reached for her shoulder. She did not twist. She sidestepped and dropped her shoulder as if she were about to apologize. The hand missed and found a different girl, who flung curses like an old fisher throws net. Arya took the chance made by the curses. Curses open space in a crowd the way a dropped coin draws eyes, and she slid down an alley that did not want to be a street, past a midden where fruit flies rose like dust, and came up on a small square where someone had set 4 chairs and a barrel to make a shop of dice. She stood for a heartbeat under an arch that cut the sky like a curved blade. She looked at her hands. She had blood under a nail, a half-moon. She turned and scraped it clean on the stone with the casual economy of a person scraping sap. She licked the finger to smooth it. It tasted like pennies and salt and something sweet that belonged to no childhood. She felt a small sickness and recognized it and let it pass. There was no room to be ill. There was no room to be glad or sorry either. Not in a street where a peddler would sell you a pear with the same hand that would take your knife if you let it. Behind the city's sounds, a deeper quiet was spreading. A hush that had nothing to do with reverence and everything to do with the way news moves like water through stone. The hush washed around corners and gathered under archways and leaned into doorways and laid its cool hand on the backs of necks across the capital. She felt it and matched her breath to it. She could not hear words yet, only the shape of them. The shape was shock, fear, hunger, opportunity. Some would call it justice because words are tools. Some would call it the work of enemies. Some would call it a sign that gods had left their altars for 1 hour and someone had taken the chance to break them. She went down to Flea Bottom because in a city like this, bottom becomes everywhere when there is blood at the top. The alleys gathered light and turned it into oil and kept it in the cracks. She passed a man sitting with his back against a wall as if playing a game with the wall and losing it, and a woman with a smile like a broken bowl who showed her 3 teeth in an attempt at friendliness and kept walking when Arya did not buy it. She slid a coin into a hand without looking, a habit that purchased not just direction but forgetfulness. Coins teach men about their own memories. She stowed the novice's coif in a pocket and let her hair, blunt and dark, show itself. A different woman now, one who had stolen a novice's towel in the bakehouse and run. The towel, within a dozen steps, had been lost resolutely in a dyer's barrel. Now she was only a small figure with a plain face and a pace that did not trouble anyone, the sort of person cities build themselves on. She turned 3 times, left and right and left. She went through a place where the ground remembered a flood and had turned to powder. She found the door she had found before, a low mouth with a crack from old hinges and a smell of old bread and new chalk, and she slipped inside a room where there was a stool and a bucket and a low bed that had never known a good panel of plank, only a rope lattice and patience. There she let her body do the things it had to do. She stripped the novice's wool. Underneath she had a shirt that belonged to nobody. She washed her hands in water that had already learned more secrets than it had signed up for when it was drawn from its well. She took the paste she had made and softened it with spit and began to lift the face. It came off in edges, as if she were peeling a fruit. She put it aside as carefully as if it were a sleeping thing. She looked at the face that came back to her in the shard of looking-glass propped on a crate. It was not a child's face, but it was not yet the face of a person people take seriously. It was a face that could be lost in the market and found again by chance. The eyes were winter, the mouth was summer. The line of the jaw was a compromise between stubborn and tired. She scraped again with her fingernails and found the skin underneath. She did not smile and did not scowl. She touched the scar that ran like a seam near the back of her neck where someone long ago had cut something out of her future and then stitched the future back up and sent her on by a different road. "You," she said to the face. The word was felt more than heard. "Who?" The floor below her creaked with someone else's life, and above her a child sang the same fragment of song 7 times and then stopped as if struck. She sat on the rope bed and held the knife in her hands and cleaned it with threadbare cloth, turning it so the light that came through the window and fell on the blade could tell her if she had done the job thoroughly. The blade did not show her face, not as water did. It showed the room, crooked, lined by the knife's curve. She slid it into a seam in the mattress and felt the thrum of the city in the rope against her thigh. The great September spell had stopped, or she could no longer hear it. She could not tell which. She thought to sleep. The body sometimes takes that decision away. Hers did not. She lay on her side and listened. She heard feet above and below, a market hawker call out late cherries in such a way that made bad cherries sound desirable. A woman cursed gently at a child who had broken a jug, a man laughed like a donkey, and then, under all of it, that hush again that was not hush but the shape of words settling into sentences and being sent out with legs. She shut her eyes. Behind her eyes, she saw the woman's face at the moment after the blade had made its simple argument. The face had not been cruel in that moment. It had been naked as any face. There was something else in it. A split-second lightness, as if part of her had stepped out of her body already and had been relieved to discover that it could. She opened her eyes again. She put the back of her hand to her mouth and bit down where the skin is thin. It hurt the right amount. She stood and went to the window and looked out at the mouth of the alley where a dog with 3 legs made a careful decision to lie in the sun despite the trouble getting up would cost him later. The sun made all this look kinder than it was. The city is always kinder in a sunny window. Tomorrow it would be a different city and the same one. She would not be here then. Across the city, in rooms that smelled of lavender and fear, men rearranged their plans with the quickness of players at a table where a new hand has been dealt with 1 fewer card. The hand of the king left a room where he had been reading a dull letter about grain in the riverlands and a duller one about ships that would not be ready until they were ready. And he walked down a hall holding his breath the way old men do who have learned that breath makes its own rules. A boy king in a room with windows overlooking a nasty little garden set with statues touched a window latch and could not open it and then cried because he could not break anything that would get him scolded. The boy's lion-colored hair gleamed like a promise, like a debt. A girl in a different room whose hair had the color of paler wheat took up a brush and brushed her hair very slowly and watched her face in a glass as if she were testing whether she would blur or remain. She had grown up with roses and thorns and knew how to let both sleep in her bed. She looked into the glass and let her mouth soften. If one is the only person able to keep one's face calm, one must charge rent for it. In the September, they laid the woman on a bier and the silent sisters covered her face. Not in disrespect, but in the ritual acknowledgement that faces are for the living. The High Septon, who had a pair of plain sandals neat as prayers by his bed and a heart like any man's heart, stood at the window of his small cell and watched a wisp of smoke from a candle twist itself into a letter he did not know the alphabet for. He had set his life on a set of ideas as plain as bread, that sin is heavy and must be set down, that the poor will be made rich in a different ledger, that pomp is a sin that men forgive in themselves when it serves them and condemn in others when it offends them. And now his ideas were being put to a test that did not care about their shape. He closed his eyes and felt the weight of a city's judgment leaning on his hand like an old woman, and he thought, "This is an hour." Men would call it chance. He called it a door to be stepped through with bare feet so he would remember where he was. In a cellar under a house with 3 shutters and a chimney that had never worked properly. A man with a small smile and soft hands wrote the day's first 2 new names on a ledger in ink that would dry brown and be read by a sensible clerk months hence, who would not believe what he read at first. The man blew dry the ink on the ledger and then turned a ring around his finger twice and slid it off to place it in a box with 3 other rings that had belonged to people who no longer needed them for ordering gardeners or comforting children. He hummed under his breath, a song about oceans finishing at land, and then he put the ring back on because the habit of having it was stronger than the purpose of putting it away. Ravens struck out from towers. Pigeons were conscripted. The city acquired a sound particular to days that will later be numbered by children, that will be used to tell time for the next decade. Before the day the Queen's mother fell on the steps, someone would say to fix a price or to describe a marriage, and another would correct, "She did not fall." And the argument would bloom anew because it is a human comfort to argue about where authority belongs, even in stories. From the river, the smell of rot and tar rose and blew backward into the tidy squares where men mowed lawns that did not need mowing. In the room with the rope bed, Arya sat with her hands on her knees and did not move for an hour. When she finally moved, it was the way an animal living in a burrow moves when its instinct tells it that the hawk has turned its eye elsewhere. She drew a small packet from beneath a board in the wall and unwrapped it and counted coins that were bright as eggs. She put half back. The other half went into the small pouch that hung against her skin beneath her shirt, where once a coin stamped with a stranger's face had hung and warmed and learned her smell. She put on a jacket that looked like a concession made by someone who hates coats and dislikes weather, and she laced it to her throat. She pulled her hair tight to her skull and bound it. She put the wooden-handled bundle away in a crack no one would notice until a year from now, when a rat would drag it out and gnaw the towel to threads. She took the knife from the mattress and tucked it into the place where the jacket and the belt had an agreement to make a sheath of their union. She did not look around the room to see if she had left anything behind that would tell a story. She never left anything behind that she wanted. When she opened the door onto the alley again, the light had gone from gold to the bleached brightness that makes every shadow a truth. The dog with 3 legs had found shade. The sky had begun to gather its noon heat like a grudge. The city had learned the new name for the day and was practicing it in private mouths before saying it aloud. 2 boys ran by, barefoot, grief and delight mixed on their faces in that way peculiar to boys for whom the city is an endless stage of new dangers and old games. One shouted, making horns with his fingers on his head. The other shouted back, hand to his heart, and fell as if struck, laughing. They were wrong in the shape of their play, but they were right that a thing had happened. Arya crossed the alley and the street beyond and then another, and made her way up toward higher ground. Not the hill of the September, not the castle. Another hill, unimportant to anyone with a title, very important to anyone who wanted to see a long way without being looked at. From there she could see strips of the city, as if they had been sliced with a cartographer's knife and arranged to tell a story. The river was a length of hammered metal. The square was a pale place with a dark knot on the steps that had grown and then loosened as the day went on, a knot untying itself around a center that no longer held. Smoke rose in one thin line from some distant roof where someone had set bread to oven and forgot it. She leaned against a wall warm from the morning and felt the heat move through the cloth into her skin. And if she closed her eyes, she could be on the sunny side of a tower at Winterfell, listening to the wind tug at banner edges and to her father's voice inside the stone saying something he had said before, that men who passed the sentence should swing the sword, that winter comes to teach patience and endings, that honor is a thing that hurts when it is working. She opened her eyes because honor had never seemed so simple and she did not trust the memory. A moth lit briefly on her knuckle and then left. She thought of the list she had once recited like a child's prayer. Names in a rhythm that soothed before sleep and warmed cold nights when she was a bit of meat in a too large forest. She thought of how some of those names were no longer names for her to say aloud. She thought of the woman whose life had run like water around Arya's fingers and into the steppes, and whether the gods who were many cared in any way about the manner of such ending. On Braavos' stone, a man had told her that every life belongs to the god of many faces and that she, too, would one day serve without her own wanting involved. The words had had the shape of belonging, and she had held them on her tongue until they drew the taste out of it. He had been right in one way. In another, he had forgotten that the old gods of the north look through leaves and do not admire trickery except when the fox needs to eat. Someone came up the slope, careful to place his feet on the stones that did not rock. He wore a cap that had seen 3 owners and a vest that had seen better backs. He stood beside her not too near, made a sound in his throat that acknowledges co-presence, lifted his face toward the September and spat once, not in disrespect or respect but in allegiance to the city's habit of spitting. He said, without turning his head, "Well now." Arya did not answer. He did not require answer. He said, "They'll be hunting. They'll be hunting like cats who have just found out what doors are for." He scratched his chin. "You want to be small today." He looked sideways at her then and saw she was already small by nature and smiled a little. Smaller. She made her own sound of co-presence, passed him 2 coppers, and took in exchange the knowledge of a man who made his living by noticing the direction of trouble and the shape of escape. He told her which gate was bristling with spears, and which had its spears quietly pointed the other way because the captain there had gone off to hear the news for himself. He told her that a certain alley had a dog that would tear a hole in you if you climbed its fence, and that a woman on Soap Street owed a favor to any girl with hair and no questions. He told her that today was not a day to cross a certain bridge because the men who had charge of it had fathers with very precise memories and were finding out what sort of men they might be if given a moment. He told her that if she were to stay, and he did not say whether she should stay, she should not sleep twice in the same bed until the river had twice emptied and refilled. He took 1 copper back, as if to pay for having said too much, and she let him. She went down by a path that looked too steep but was not, and she threaded through a market where fruit like jewels sweated under damp cloth, and a woman held up 2 apples to show a man, and he shook his head. A delicate conversation made entirely of gestures across 10 feet of space. The air had warmed fully. The great September, tall above the square, threw a shadow like a question mark across the steps now, and men were struggling in that shadow with a beer's ungainly dignity. White cloth, a smear caught even at that distance. A clatter as one of the bearers misstepped and corrected with a grunt. An old woman near Arya flinched and crossed herself in 2 traditions and muttered a word in a 3rd language that she had learned from an uncle and never used except on days when someone with power died. Without knowing she had decided to do it, Arya bought a pear and ate half of it and did not taste it. She chewed because bodies are machines and machines require their fuel. She handed the rest to a child who had been pretending not to look at it. The child took it and stuck his tongue out at her and ran, and she felt something close to gratitude for the insult. She turned away from the September because to look longer would do a thing to the day that she did not want done. She let the city open its small doors. A tanner's yard where hides dripped like sad banners. A dyer's hut where velvet unrolled itself in an impossible river of blue. A room where 2 women sat face to face and formed tokens out of clay, one by one, the older murmuring a verse of numbers so soft it sounded like a lullaby. By the time the sun sat in the west like a crust of bread left too long in an oven, the stories had grown legs and arms and teeth. Someone said the woman had knelt and begged for her life. Someone said she had gone down like a tree, stiff with pride. Someone said her son had run to the steps with his shirt open and his bare feet in the square and had been dragged back by a gardener. Someone said she had been stabbed 3, 5, 11 times, some sacred number that gave shape to chaos and made it comfortable to tell. Someone said the blade had been poisoned, a comfort to those who like their dying tidy. Someone said the gods had done it themselves, offended by something she had thought or done or been. Someone said it was no one. Someone said a ghost. Someone said the name of a house from the north and someone slapped him. Words make their own crowds. Each story carried a name for the city's anger like a candle through a dark church. A different candle, a different light, the same darkness. A boy in a green doublet whose breast held thorns stood at a long table and ran a finger along a map and said a word that made men who had never bowed before bow, because grief in a king makes kings of other men for a while. A woman in a dress with sleeves like leaves and a mouth like a locked chest placed her hand over his. The queen wife whose smiles had been taught to mean anything and nothing, and she said something he did not hear. In a cellar, a man lifted a glass and did not drink and put it down and lifted it again to see his face distorted in its belly and finally drank out of sheer stubbornness. On the river, a boatman who had moved bodies down to the bay after a fire put his hands together and asked the mother who had never answered any of his prayers for the loan of her hand to guide his through the dark that would be coming. At a city gate, a captain adjusted his belt and looked north without seeing and then looked south on purpose and nodded to a boy to lift the bar and then changed his mind and shook his head and the boy lowered the bar again and looked as if he had been denied a larger story. In the room on the unimportant hill, Arya washed again and unbound and rebound her hair and lay on the rope bed and let the day's weight sit on her like a cat. Sleep came in small pieces that did not join. She dreamed briefly of snow that fell so slowly it could be counted. And in the dream she counted it and each flake had the shape of a knife, each with a different name carved into it. And when they melted, the water ran under a door and into a room where a man with a honeyed voice and no face sat counting coins and each coin had a different face on it and each face had empty eyes. She woke to the sound of feet in the hall and the measured talk of men who had taken trouble as they climbed the stairs. 2 of them, a rhythm that the city wore to bed like a shift. She took the knife from the mattress and went to the door and put her ear to it. The footsteps passed. A door opened. A woman laughed the way women laugh when they have chosen to laugh because not to would be something like treason to the day. The men did not laugh. They asked questions that sounded like suggestions, and the woman answered them with the skill of a person who has watched pot lids when water starts to leap. The questions went down the hall. The men knocked at each door in turn, politics by the old method. They did not knock at hers. They would come back later with less politeness. They would go to the bakehouse and ask questions of the boy with flour on his lashes who turned loaves without looking. They would go to the sacristy and ask questions of women who had never been seen by men when not in grief. They would pull on the city's loose threads. They would ask for the story to be told a different way, a way that gave them somebody to put hands on. The city would oblige because it is easier to give hands a thing to hold. Arya took a breath and got up and pulled on boots that had learned her feet. She packed the small pouch and tied it under her shirt again. She went to the window and looked down at the alley. It was quiet in the way of late afternoons when heat leans against the wall and men have drunk and decided not to fight until evening. She listened. She turned away and lifted the floorboard and took out a small packet of papers that bore names that could be used like keys. She chose one she had not used yet. A name belonging to no one of interest, a girl who had a cousin somewhere with too many children and a sour father. She might be called to mind by a neighbor who liked to borrow salt. She took that name and tucked it under her tongue like a seed. She thought of leaving at once. Men with questions had a way of becoming men with hands, and men with hands had a way of becoming men with blades. It is clever to be somewhere else when that happens. But something tugged. Not caution, not pride. If she left now, she would leave the shape of the day unvisited across the length of the afternoon to the evening, and the day would shape itself without her. She wanted to see who the city would be with this new absence at the center of its stories. She wanted to breathe the air of it once more before she took her body out of it. She wanted to know if the woman's face would be shown under cloth and whether people would be allowed to confess the things they wanted to confess and whether a man with a gold hand would ride up the street in a storm of his own making. Too late for anything that mattered, just in time to make things worse. She went down the stairs and into the evening. The sun had tilted. The streets were a slow river of men going home with nothing and women coming out with baskets and girls with their hair undone because there had been no time to make it neat. Bells from docks sounded a different race than the bell in the September, a workman's time against a god's. She kept to the edge of things. On a corner where a baker sold sweet buns, she found the boy with flower lashes. He was laughing now, head thrown back, telling a story about a man who had fallen asleep at a table waiting for his bread, and had woken to find the loaf used as a pillow. He saw her for the smallest part of a second and then saw past her again. It was a kindness of the kind that costs nothing and saves lives. She passed a shrine where someone had set a single apple, too green to eat, as an offering. She took it up and set it down again in a different place, as if to remind the gods that offerings can and should be moved, that nothing is fixed, that the apple belongs as much to the person who moves it as to the god who does not. She went up to the edge of the square and stood an angle from where she could see and not be seen. The beer had been taken in. The steps were being washed with buckets and rags. The water ran down the gutters and made small dams where leaves had gathered. A woman on her knees with a rag looked up and rubbed her forehead with the back of her hand and made a face of annoyance at a leaf that refused to move and then laughed quietly at herself and kept rubbing. A boy had found a gold thread in the crack of a step and had hooked it out with something stolen and held it up to the sun, and it burned there, and he hid it quickly, as if the sun might tell. A man in plain robes stood at the top of the steps with his hands folded. The High Septon. He looked like a sack of lentils would look if it were given a head. Next to him, men in green and white and men in red and men in mottled leathers stood with expressions arranged like tools on a bench. They were alive with the consideration of one another, where their strengths lay, where their weaknesses, which way the day wind was going to blow. Words passed between them like cups of water. The High Septon lifted a hand, too small a gesture for the size of the square, and the square quieted anyway because men who lead without volume are a novelty, and the city loves novelty until it learns its price. He spoke. Arya could not hear the words. She did not need to. The shape of the speaking was familiar. Justice, gods, sorrow, the sins of pride, the victory of humility, the necessity of order, the promise of consequence. The crowd made the usual sounds at the usual places, except now the sounds had a small edge on them, a beginning of night edge, people who did not want to go home yet because home would have questions they did not want to answer. He finished. He lowered his hand. Men of the Reach nodded, counting. Men of the Keep's household looked to one another for a signal that did not come and resented it. Men who sold onions thought about how a sermon changes the price of onions. The city put its face back on. Arya stood a while longer, letting the light use her eyes. The September statues looked back at her the way statues do, holy and not at all. The stranger's hood was darker than the others because of the way light fell this hour. She remembered a story of a woman who had gone to the stranger and asked for mercy for those she loved and had been told, in no words, that the stranger hears only endings and cannot be asked for nothing in an hour before a storm. Arya felt a pity in herself for the woman on the steps that surprised her in its smallness and its intensity. Pity does not annul wrath. It runs alongside it like a dog with one ear down and one ear up. She looked down at her hands again and saw that one had a small streak of flour where she had brushed the baker's door passing. She rubbed it away. She turned and walked into the evening with a pace that would take her, if not out of the city, then toward the part of it that felt most like a way out. The docks where men had learned to leave and come back and leave again without asking anyone but the river for permission. The mast stood like an orchard of black trees. A man with scars like continents stared at her and then past her and then back at her, then shook his head and laughed at his own mistakes and called out to someone whose name was a sort of song. At the end of a pier, under a pile of nets, a boy with a hairlip was sleeping with his head on a wrapped sail and a knife under his palm. Arya felt nothing but envy for that sleep. She walked the pier to its end and looked down into the water. It looked like old iron there, pocked by salt. She, though, awed of the sea she had crossed to come back here, and of the fact that a sea is always both the thing you think it is and a room no one has walked into yet. She did not have to decide now which room she would enter next, but she wanted to be ready to step quick when it opened without knocking. The evening gave up its heat unwillingly. The city lit small fires in windows and at stalls and in the heart's need to see, and the dark moved in and out of those lights as a man moves in and out of a group of old friends. Arya returned to the room in the low house the way a thought returns, easily, without needing the roads. She lay down, and this time sleep found her without insistence. In sleep, no faces came, or if they came as masks on the back of birds, and the birds wheeled until they were no longer birds but leaves, and the leaves settled on water, and the water became the plain marble floor of a room with tall windows where someone had once stood barefoot learning the size of her shadow. In the far rooms of the keep, a boy king put his head on a pillow that had never held a woman's hair and cried once like a child, and then stopped because there was no one in the room to hear him, and that seemed foolish. A man with a gold hand received a raven that had flown hard and read a letter that held 5 sentences and 2 lies, and he went to the window and looked south until the dark took the horizon, and then he went to his horse and told a groom to saddle it, and then told him to go back to bed because he would leave at dawn, because men like him think the sun is a formality that asks their permission to rise. The city turned on its side and dozed and startled and dreamed. It dreamed of a woman walking down bright steps and of a small person at her side and of a sudden lack of a future that had felt certain. It dreamed of winter walking down from the north with a slow patience that no bell could hurry. It dreamed of ships and wolves and gardens and of men who think they are the center of every dream and who are sometimes right because they carry their centers with their arrogance like a camp kettle. It dreamed of a girl counting, and of the counting stopping and starting, and of a voice that had learned how to say many names and give none of them away. In the morning there would be more bells. There would be lists. There would be words like treason and conspiracy, and there would be men with hats who would use these words like chisels to try to split the day into smaller pieces they could carry. There would be meat turned in markets and bread hidden under tables and knives tucked into boots. There would be a face on a bier and the city's attempt to decide whether to love it or despise it now that it could not look back. There would be ravens lifting from the tower with their black thoughts going outward and a man standing in a doorway with his arm across it, as if he believed his arm could stop a story at the threshold. There would be a girl walking in a jacket that had learned her shape toward a gate that would not be the one anyone watched. For now, the city breathed. For now, a bell that had rung itself to meaning slept. For now, a room with a rope bed held a weight that had traveled a long way to set itself down for a moment. For now, the woman who had met the blade with her eyes closed lay in a place where voices are not required. For now, a name had been crossed from a list, and the list rolled itself up and waited, patient as winter.